I stood at my father's wake in a black dress, watching my uncle hand out copies of a new will that cut me out completely. He had the paper. He had the witnesses. He had the confidence of someone who thought he had won before anyone else knew the game was even being played. I said nothing. I just stood there with my hands at my sides and let him smile at the relatives who suddenly had no reason to stay on my side, because I already knew what he didn't. My father's lawyer was waiting in the back of the room with a sealed envelope. And in 30 seconds, my uncle was going to understand that you cannot forge a will when the real one never left the attorney's hands. This wasn't a random courtroom drama. This was my father's funeral. The same man who spent 30 years building a small business and a reputation for fairness. And my uncle thought he could rewrite history with a single forged document. But he forgot one thing. My father trusted his lawyer more than his brother. That sealed envelope contained everything my uncle tried to erase. Over 12,000 will contests happen every year in this country, most of them between people who once shared holidays and birthrights. This one wasn't about money. It was about whether the truth could survive the greed of the people left behind. What my uncle didn't know was that the real story started decades before that wake, and it was about something far more valuable than any inheritance. My father, Richard Caldwell, built Caldwell Home Goods from a single storefront in Willow Creek into a chain of 6 locations across 3 counties. He started in 1987 with a loan from his mother and a handshake from a distributor who took a chance on a guy with no college degree and too much ambition. By the time I was born, he had 2 stores and a reputation for treating employees like family. People who worked for him stayed for decades. They brought him their kids' graduation photos and their medical problems, and he helped where he could, quietly, without making it about himself. My Uncle Paul was 10 years younger. He came into the business in the mid-90s after burning through 3 jobs and a marriage that ended badly. My father gave him a position managing inventory at the original store. It was supposed to be a second chance. Instead, it became a slow poison. Paul resented being the younger brother who needed rescuing. He resented the way customers asked for Richard instead of him. He resented that my father never made him a partner, even after 15 years of loyal work. But he never said any of that out loud. He just smiled and showed up and let the bitterness calcify in private. I grew up inside those stores. I remember the smell of cardboard and floor wax, the sound of the cash drawers slamming shut, the way my father's hands looked after a day of stacking boxes. He worked harder than anyone I have ever known. He also loved me in a way that was almost entirely silent. He was not good with words. He never told me he was proud or asked about my feelings. But he kept every piece of art I ever made, stored in a filing cabinet in his office behind the customer service desk. I did not know that until after he died. My mother left when I was 6. She said she could not compete with the business. The truth was simpler. She wanted a husband who came home before dark, and my father was never going to be that man. The divorce was civil on paper, but cold underneath. She moved to Florida and sent birthday cards with checks that felt like obligations. I saw her twice between ages 7 and 18. So it was just me and my father, living in a house that felt too big for 2 people, eating dinner at the kitchen counter while he reviewed spreadsheets and I did homework. Paul was around more after my mother left. He started coming to Sunday dinners, bringing takeout and a bottle of wine like he was filling a gap. My father appreciated the company. I was more cautious, but I could not explain why. Paul laughed too loud at jokes that were not funny. He asked too many questions about the business finances. He made comments about my father's health, suggesting he should slow down, delegate more, maybe take a vacation. My father dismissed it as brotherly concern. I heard it as something else, a kind of positioning, like a man checking the distance between himself and the door. The first real sign of trouble came in 2018, when my father turned 62. He had a mild heart attack while unloading a shipment of kitchen mixers at the warehouse. He was in the hospital for 4 days, and I flew home from Denver the same night. Paul handled the stores while my father recovered, and that was when the dynamic shifted. Paul hired a new accountant without consulting anyone. He changed the supplier contracts on 2 of the stores. He started coming to the hospital with paperwork for my father to sign, always apologetic, always explaining that it was routine, just keeping things moving. My father signed everything because he trusted his brother. He was weak and tired and afraid of losing what he had built. He did not read the fine print. He never asked for a second opinion. By the time he was discharged, Paul had quietly installed himself as co-signer on the business accounts and taken control of the inventory purchasing. It was not illegal. It was not even unethical by a strict reading. But it was deliberate, and it was designed to make Paul indispensable. Over the next 2 years, my father's health declined slowly. He had a second heart attack in 2020, then a stroke in early 2021 that affected his speech and mobility. I visited every 3 months, sometimes more. Each time, I noticed Paul's presence in the business had expanded. My father no longer made decisions alone. He consulted Paul for everything. The staff started going to Paul with problems instead of Richard. The office that once held my childhood artwork became Paul's secondary workspace, and one day I walked in and found the filing cabinet gone. When I asked Paul about it, he said he had cleared out old paperwork to make room. He did not know what happened to the cabinet. He suggested it might have been thrown away. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Not legally wrong, not yet, but wrong in the way that makes your stomach tighten. My father was still alive, still the owner of the business, but the business no longer belonged to him in any meaningful sense. Paul had become the face of Caldwell Home Goods, and my father was too proud or too scared to admit that he had let it happen. I tried to talk to him about it during a visit in November of 2021. We were sitting in his living room, him in the recliner he barely left anymore, me on the couch with a cup of coffee I was not drinking. I told him I was worried about Paul's influence. I told him he needed to talk to a lawyer to get his affairs in order, to make sure his wishes were documented legally. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, "Sophia, your uncle is the only family I have left besides you, and you live 1,000 miles away. If I push him away, I die alone." I told him that was not true. He did not believe me. Or maybe he did, but the fear of loneliness was stronger than the instinct for self-preservation. Either way, he did not call a lawyer. He did not write a will. He let the days pass, and Paul kept consolidating. Then, in March of 2022, my father died. A third heart attack, sudden and final, in the back room of the original store. He was 66 years old. I got the call from the store manager, not from Paul. By the time I landed in Chicago, Paul had already arranged the funeral, contacted the newspaper for an obituary, and scheduled a meeting with a family attorney for the following week. When I asked why the meeting was necessary, Paul said there were business matters to resolve. He said it with the same smile he had worn for 30 years, patient and unreadable. I did not see the will until the wake. Paul walked in with a stack of photocopies and handed them to everyone who mattered. Relatives, business partners, the longtime store managers. It was a simple document dated 2 weeks before my father's death, typed on plain paper with 2 witness signatures. It left the business entirely to Paul. It left me nothing. Not the house, not the savings, not even the contents of the filing cabinet that had already disappeared. I stood there in my black dress, holding the paper, watching Paul accept condolences like a man who had just won a lottery he had not bought a ticket for. The relatives looked at me with pity and confusion. The managers looked at the floor, and I said nothing, because I knew something Paul did not. My father had called me 2 days before he died. He had sounded different, clearer than he had in months. He said he was sorry. He said he had made mistakes. And he said he had taken care of something with the lawyer, something I would understand when the time came. He did not explain further. He just said, "Check your mail." I checked my mail the morning after he died. There was nothing unusual. But that afternoon, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. It was Martin Shaw, my father's attorney, the same man who had represented Caldwell Home Goods since the first store opened. He said my father had come to see him privately in January without telling anyone. He had drafted a will, signed it in front of 2 witnesses from the law firm, and left it in a sealed envelope with strict instructions. It was not to be opened until the wake, and only if another will was presented. Martin was in the back of the funeral home that night. He was holding the envelope, and Paul had no idea. Martin stood near the back wall of the funeral home, dressed in a dark suit that matched the occasion, holding a manila envelope with my father's law firm logo printed in the corner. He did not approach the front. He waited, patient as stone, while Paul finished accepting condolences from a distant cousin and turned back toward the table where the forged will lay photocopied and proud. I caught Martin's eye. He nodded once. That was the signal. I walked over to him, and the room started to notice. Conversations faded. People turned. Paul looked up from the table and saw Martin holding the envelope, and I watched his face cycle through confusion, irritation, and something else. Something that looked like the beginning of fear. Martin spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Martin Shaw, attorney for Richard Caldwell for 34 years. I am here to discharge my duty to my client. Mr. Caldwell came to my office on January 12th of this year, 2 months before his death, and executed a last will and testament in the presence of 2 witnesses from my staff. That will was signed, notarized, and placed in a sealed envelope with instructions that it be opened only if another will was presented after his passing. Since a will has been presented tonight, I am now obligated to read the true and final will of Richard Caldwell." Paul's voice cut through the silence. "That's not possible. Richard was in no condition to visit a law firm in January. He could barely walk." Martin did not raise his voice. He said, "He was driven by a home health aide named Deborah Chen. I have her signed statement. I have video footage from our building security showing him entering and leaving. And I have a letter from his cardiologist stating that while his mobility was limited, his mental faculties were fully intact at the time of the signing." He pulled out a stack of documents, stapled and clean. Then he began to read. The will was short. It left the house and all personal property to me, Sophia Caldwell. It left the business equally divided between me and Paul, but with one condition. I would have controlling interest and final say on all major decisions. It also included a specific clause that had not appeared in any previous version of my father's estate planning. A clause that addressed any document bearing a date after January 10th. That clause said, and I remember these words exactly, "Any will, codicil, or testamentary document purporting to be signed by me after January 10th of this year is considered invalid unless executed in the presence of my attorney, Martin Shaw, or his designated legal representative." This clause is included because I have reason to believe that individuals close to me may attempt to influence or forge my signature after my health has deteriorated. The room went completely quiet. Paul's face had lost all color. The forged will in his hand became worthless paper. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something worse. I felt the weight of what my father must have known in his final months. He had suspected Paul. He had seen it coming. And instead of confronting his brother directly, instead of cutting him off, he had built a legal trap and then died before he could see its spring. Paul recovered his composure faster than I expected. He said the will was fraudulent, that my father had been manipulated by the home health aide and the lawyer, that he would contest it in court. He said it loudly enough for the relatives to hear, trying to create doubt. But the relatives had already seen the 2 witnesses listed on the document. They knew those names. They were people from the law firm who had worked with my father for years. Credible people. People who had nothing to gain. Martin handed me a copy of the will. He also handed me a separate envelope, smaller, marked personal. He said my father had asked him to give it to me after the reading. I did not open it at the funeral home. I waited until I got back to my hotel room, sat on the edge of the bed, and tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten letter. My father's handwriting, shaky but legible. He wrote that he was sorry for not being stronger. He wrote that he had known for years that Paul was skimming money from the business. Small amounts at first, then larger. Paul had covered it with creative accounting and fake supplier invoices. My father had discovered it during the audit that followed his first heart attack. He had confronted Paul privately, and Paul had begged for another chance, promised to pay it back, swore it would never happen again. My father had believed him. He always believed the best in people. It was his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. The letter continued. Paul had not stopped. He had gotten better at hiding it. By 2020, the total was over $140,000. My father knew that if he reported it, Paul would face criminal charges. He could not bring himself to destroy his brother, so he made a different choice. He decided to protect me instead. He drafted the new will with Martin, set up the sealed envelope, and left behind a paper trail that would expose Paul if he ever tried to take more than he was given. The letter ended with these words: "Sophia, I failed to protect you when you were growing up. I was too busy building something I thought mattered. I realize now that you always mattered more. I hope this letter finds you before Paul does something foolish. I love you. I always did. I just did not know how to say it." I sat in that hotel room and cried harder than I had at the funeral. Not for the money, not for the business, for the years I had spent believing my father did not care. For the way we had both been too stubborn or too scared to bridge the distance between us. And for the fact that the only time he finally said the words, he was already gone. The next morning, I received a call from Martin. Paul had filed a formal challenge to the will in probate court. He was claiming undue influence. He was claiming that I had coerced my father in his weakened state. He was claiming that the home health aide had been bribed. He had even found a witness, an old employee from one of the stores, who claimed to have heard my father say he wanted Paul to have everything. That witness was a man named Gary Thompson, who had been fired by my father 5 years earlier for stealing from the register. Paul had reached deep into the bottom of the barrel. The probate process was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. That gave me exactly 42 days to prove that the will my father signed in January was valid and that the will Paul presented at the wake was a forgery. Martin was confident. He had the security footage, the witness statements, the notary logs. But Paul had something too: time, local connections, and a willingness to lie under oath. I stayed in Illinois. I rented a furnished apartment in Willow Creek, the first time I had lived in that town since I was a child. I walked past the old stores, now closed and dark, their windows papered over. I visited the places my father used to love: the diner where he ate breakfast every Sunday, the hardware store where he bought supplies, the park bench near the river where he sometimes sat after work. Every corner of that town held a piece of him I had not known I was searching for. I also started digging into Paul's finances. Martin's associate, a young paralegal named Rachel, helped me access public records. What we found was damning. Paul had taken out a personal loan for $80,000 in early 2021, using his share of the business as collateral. He had also transferred ownership of a piece of commercial property, a warehouse my father had bought years ago, into a shell company that Paul controlled. The transfer had been signed with my father's name, but the date was February 2nd, 2022, 1 month before my father died. My father had been in the hospital that day. He could not have signed anything. We had him. The forgery was not limited to the will. It extended to property deeds, loan documents, and supplier contracts. Paul had been building a fortress of lies for years, and the weight of it was about to collapse on him. But Paul was not the only one with secrets. As I continued sorting through my father's personal files, I found a locked drawer in his home office that I had never been able to open. The key was taped to the underside of his desk, where he had always kept a spare. Inside the drawer was a second set of financial records: bank statements, wire transfers, and letters from a law firm in Florida. These records did not involve Paul. They involved my mother. I had not spoken to her in 16 years. I assumed she was still in Orlando, living the life she had chosen when she left. But according to these documents, she had been receiving monthly payments from my father. Large payments. $50,000 a year for the past 15 years. The letters from the Florida law firm referenced a confidentiality agreement and a medical condition. They did not specify what that condition was. I sat in my father's office with the drawer open and the papers spread across the desk, trying to understand what I was looking at. My father had been supporting my mother in secret for over a decade, and he had never told me, not once, not even in his letter. I called Martin and asked him if he knew about the payments. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he said, "Your father asked me to keep that confidential. He made me promise. I am legally bound by attorney-client privilege even now. But I can tell you this, the arrangement was not what you think, and it may change everything you believe about why your mother left." The line went quiet. I asked him what he meant. He said he could not say more without breaking his oath, but he suggested that I go to Florida. He suggested that I talk to my mother before the probate hearing. I had 42 days. I had a forged will to fight. I had an uncle who was willing to lie in court. And now I had a mother I had not spoken to in 16 years, receiving secret payments from a father I thought had no relationship with her at all. The bridge between the life I thought I understood and the truth I was about to uncover was built from a single key, a locked drawer, and a lawyer who knew more than he could say. I booked a flight to Orlando that night. The flight to Orlando gave me 3 hours to stare at the clouds and wonder what kind of truth I was flying toward. I had built my entire understanding of my childhood around the story my mother left because she could not handle the business or the marriage. That version of events had been confirmed by my father's silence, by Paul's dismissive comments, by the simple geography of a woman who moved 1,000 miles away and never looked back. But the payments in that locked drawer suggested a different story entirely. I landed at Orlando International and rented a car. The address from the bank statements led to a small assisted living facility about 40 minutes north of the city, tucked behind a strip mall and a row of palm trees that looked like they had been planted as an afterthought. The building was clean but cheap. Vinyl flooring, pastel walls, the faint smell of institutional cleaner. I told the front desk I was there to see a resident named Margaret Caldwell. The woman at the desk checked her computer and said, "Room 214. She doesn't get many visitors." I walked down the hallway slowly. My heart was beating harder than I wanted to admit. I had not seen my mother's face since I was 16. She had shown up to my high school graduation, sat in the back row, left before I could find her. I had assumed that was evidence of her indifference. Now I wondered if it was something else. I knocked on the door. A thin voice said, "Come in." She was sitting in a chair by the window, wrapped in a light blanket despite the Florida heat outside. Her hair was gray and thin. Her face had lines I did not remember, but her eyes were the same. She looked at me and did not seem surprised. She said, "I was wondering when you would find out." I sat down across from her. I asked her what was going on. She told me she had been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's disease in 2007, when I was 17. She had hidden it from everyone except my father. The symptoms started with a tremor in her left hand, then progressed to balance issues, then to the kind of cognitive fog that made it impossible for her to work or live alone. The assisted living facility cost $4,000 a month. My father had been paying it silently for 15 years. I asked her why she left. She said she did not want me to watch her deteriorate. She said she had watched her own mother die from the same disease, slowly, and she could not put me through that. She said my father had offered to care for her at home. She had refused. She said the only way she could protect me from the pain of watching her fade was to disappear while she still could. I asked her why she never told me the truth. She said she was ashamed. She said she wanted me to remember her as the woman who left, not as the woman who needed help to walk to the bathroom. She said my father had agreed to the secrecy because he loved her enough to let her make that choice. I asked her about Paul. She closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she told me something that changed everything. Paul had found out about her condition in 2015. He had discovered the payments while going through the business accounts during one of my father's hospital stays. Instead of keeping the secret, he had used it. He told my father that if he ever tried to cut Paul out of the business, Paul would expose the payments to the IRS as potential fraud, drag the family through a public investigation, and make sure I found out that my mother was a burden my father had been hiding for years. Paul had been blackmailing my own father for 7 years. I sat in that small room and watched my mother cry for the first time in my memory. She said my father had never told her about the blackmail. She only pieced it together after his death, when she saw the stress in his voice during their last phone call. She said he called her 2 days before he died and told her that he had finally done something about Paul. He said he had made sure everything would be taken care of. He said he loved her. Then he hung up. The next day, my father was dead. Heart attack, sudden and final. I asked her if she thought Paul had something to do with his death. She did not answer directly. She just said that stress kills people with weak hearts, and Paul had been a master at manufacturing stress. I stayed with her for 3 days. We talked more than we had in 30 years combined. I learned about the woman she used to be before the disease, the artist who painted watercolors of the Florida coastline, the cook who made elaborate dinners for neighbors, the mother who read to me every night until I fell asleep. She had been a good mother before the Parkinsons took her. I had forgotten that. I had let the story of abandonment overwrite the memory of love. On the third day, I flew back to Illinois. I had 2 weeks until the probate hearing. But I was carrying something new. The knowledge that Paul had been blackmailing my father, that the forged will was only the final act of a much longer manipulation, and that my father's death might not have been entirely natural. Martin met me at the airport. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That changes the legal strategy. Undue influence cases rely on showing that the testator was isolated and controlled. If Paul was blackmailing Richard, that is coercion. That invalidates any will Paul touched, and it opens the door for a criminal investigation." I asked him if we could prove the blackmail. He said it would be difficult without a paper trail, but there were other ways. Bank records showing Paul's financial pressure, witness statements from my mother about what she knew, and maybe something my father had left behind that we had not found yet. I went back to my father's house. I searched every drawer, every closet, every box in the attic. I found old tax returns, photo albums, appliance manuals. I did not find anything about Paul's blackmail. I was about to give up when I remembered the filing cabinet Paul had thrown away, the one that used to hold my childhood artwork. Paul said he had disposed of it, but my father was not the kind of man who threw things away. He kept everything. I called the store manager, a woman named Diane who had worked for my father for 22 years. I asked her if she knew what happened to the filing cabinet. She hesitated. Then she said, "Paul told me to take it to the dumpster, but I couldn't do that. Your father loved that cabinet. I put it in the back storage room behind the old display racks. I don't think Paul ever checked." I drove to the original store. The lights were off. The doors were locked. But Diane met me with a key. We walked through the dark aisles past empty shelves and dusty floor displays. In the back storage room, behind a stack of old mannequins and broken shelving units, sat the filing cabinet. It was dusty but intact. I pulled open the top drawer. It was full of folders. Employee records, supplier contracts, old invoices. I kept digging. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of faded catalogs, I found a manila folder with my name on it. Inside was every piece of art I had ever made. Crayon drawings from kindergarten, watercolor paintings from elementary school, sketchbook pages from middle school, report cards with my art grades circled, a letter I had written him from summer camp when I was 9, asking if he missed me. He had kept it all, every single piece. And at the bottom of the folder, underneath everything, was a sealed envelope. It was dated February 28, 2022, 4 days before he died. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a handwritten note and a USB drive. The note said, "Sophia, if you are reading this, I am gone. This drive contains everything. Bank records, voice recordings, copies of every document Paul forced me to sign. I recorded our conversations because I knew I would need proof. Do not confront him alone. Go to the authorities. I love you, Dad." I sat on the dusty floor of the empty store and held that USB drive like it was made of glass. My father had been preparing for this. He had known Paul would try to destroy us, and he had left me a weapon. I did not go to the authorities that night. I went to Paul's house. I parked across the street and watched the lights in his windows. I thought about what my father's note said. Do not confront him alone. But I was done following instructions. I had spent my whole life being protected from the truth. It was time to face it. I called Martin and told him what I had found. He begged me to wait. He said Paul was dangerous, that people who have been cornered do desperate things. I told him I would be careful. I hung up and got out of the car. The probate hearing was in 2 weeks, but the war was about to end tonight. The walk to Paul's front door was maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like crossing a battlefield. Each step carried the weight of everything I had learned in the past 2 weeks. The blackmail, the forged documents, the money he had siphoned, the stress he had manufactured, and the possibility, unproven but lodged in my chest like a splinter, that my father's heart attack had not been an accident. I knocked, Paul opened the door wearing the same measured expression he had worn at the wake. Controlled, curious, slightly amused. It was the face of a man who had spent decades believing he was smarter than everyone else in the room. He saw the USB drive in my hand, and the amusement flickered. He said, "Sophia, you should have called first." I said, "I found the recordings." He did not ask what recordings. He knew exactly what I was talking about. His jaw tightened. He stepped back and let me inside. The house was ordinary. Beige walls, a couch that had seen better years, a television playing a baseball game on mute. This was where my uncle had lived while slowly dismantling my father's life. Not a mansion, not a fortress, just a regular house with a regular man who had made extraordinary choices. I sat down on the edge of his couch. I told him everything I knew: the blackmail, the forged property transfer, the loan documents signed with my father's name while he was in the hospital, the will he had produced at the wake, which my father's attorney had already disproven. I told him about the USB drive, the voice recordings of their conversations, the bank records, the paper trail he had been too arrogant to destroy. Paul listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat down across from me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, "You think you know the whole story. You don't." I told him to explain. He leaned forward. His voice dropped. He said my father had not been an innocent victim. He said Richard Caldwell had built the business on a foundation of shortcuts and lies. The first store had been financed with money that was not entirely legal. The distributor deal in '87 had involved kickbacks. The expansion into the third county had been funded by a loan from a man with ties to organized crime. My father had spent 30 years laundering his reputation, while Paul handled the dirty work. I told him I did not believe him. He stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the living room, the same model my father had kept in his office. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were documents I had never seen before. Loan agreements with signatures that looked like my father's. Letters from a man named Vincent Rossi, whose name I recognized from a news story about a federal investigation into money laundering in the Midwest. And a photocopy of a check for $50,000 made out to my father, dated 1987, with no memo line. I stared at the papers. My hands were shaking again. Paul said, "I'm not saying what I did was right. I blackmailed him. I forged documents. I took money that was not mine, but I did not start this. Richard started this. He built an empire on a lie, and he needed me to keep it standing. When he got sick, he got scared. He wanted to clean everything up, leave you a legacy that was clean, but you cannot clean 30 years of dirt. So he wrote a new will and tried to cut me out. I defended myself. That is what I did. I defended myself. I asked him why he had not destroyed the evidence. He said because my father had kept copies too. It was a mutual assured destruction arrangement. The only way either of them could stay safe was if both stayed quiet. The USB drive I held in my hand contained recordings of Paul threatening my father, but it also, presumably, contained recordings of my father agreeing to illegal arrangements. I asked him if he killed my father. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I did not have to. The stress I put him under did the work. I made sure he could not sleep. I made sure he worried every day about being exposed. I made sure his heart got weaker and weaker. And then I waited. It took years, but it worked. I did not put my hands on him. I just made his life unbearable. The heart attack was a natural consequence of the pressure I applied. That is not murder. That is cause and effect." I sat in his living room holding the folder and the USB drive, realizing that I had walked into a trap of my own making. I had come to confront a villain. I had found a man who believed he was justified, and he had handed me evidence that implicated my father in crimes I had never imagined. I asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted me to drop the will contest. He would take the business, sell it, split the proceeds with me 50-50. He would disappear. I would never hear from him again, and the truth about my father would stay buried. If I refused, he would release the documents. He would drag my father's name through the mud, destroy the reputation of a man who could no longer defend himself, and leave me with nothing but the knowledge that my father was not the hero I had built him up to be. I had a choice: accept the deal and protect my father's memory. or refuse and watch everything he built, everything I thought I knew about him, collapse into ash. I told him I needed time to think. He said I had until the probate hearing. I walked out of his house with the folder and the USB drive, and I drove back to my father's house in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table until sunrise, going through the documents, comparing them to the recordings on the drive. The recordings confirmed Paul's threats. They also confirmed that my father had engaged in illegal financial activities for decades. The voice of my father on those recordings did not sound like the man I remembered. He sounded desperate, cornered, willing to do anything to protect what he had built. I called Martin the next morning. I told him everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "This changes nothing legally. The will your father signed in January is still valid. The blackmail only strengthens your claim of undue influence, but it does change the moral landscape. You have to decide what kind of truth you want to leave behind." I asked him what he would do. He said, "I am not your father. I cannot answer that for you." I spent the next 10 days in a state of paralysis. I visited my mother again in Florida. I told her what I had found. She cried. She said she had suspected something like this, but she had chosen not to ask. She said she had loved my father despite his flaws, and she still loved him. She said the truth did not have to destroy the good parts. The night before the probate hearing, I made my decision. I called Paul and told him I would not take the deal. I told him I would present every piece of evidence in court. I would let the truth fall where it landed. If my father's reputation suffered, so be it. I would rather live with an imperfect truth than a perfect lie. Paul said, "You are making a mistake." I said, "Maybe, but it is my mistake to make." The probate hearing was held in the county courthouse in Willow Creek. The room was small and crowded. Paul sat on one side of the aisle with his attorney. I sat on the other with Martin. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses and a patient voice. She asked for opening statements. Martin presented the sealed envelope, the witness statements, the security footage, the bank records showing Paul's embezzlement. He presented the recordings of Paul threatening my father. He presented the forged property transfer dated during my father's hospital stay. Paul's attorney argued that my father had been a willing participant in illegal activities, that the blackmail was a reaction to my father's own crimes, that the will my father signed in January was invalid because it was signed under the pressure of an ongoing conspiracy. He submitted the Rossi loan documents. He submitted the $50,000 check from 1987. He submitted letters that showed my father had knowingly engaged in fraud. The judge listened to both sides. She reviewed the documents. She took a recess for an hour. When she returned, she delivered her ruling. She said the will signed in January was valid. The blackmail did not invalidate it. It strengthened the case for undue influence by Paul. The forged will presented at the wake was a clear attempt to defraud. Paul's own evidence of my father's illegal activities, while credible, did not affect the validity of the will itself. The business would be divided according to the January will, with controlling interest going to me. She also ordered a criminal investigation into Paul's actions, including the embezzlement, the property fraud, and the attempted forgery. Paul sat motionless as the ruling was read. His attorney leaned over and whispered something. Paul did not respond. He just stared at the table. I walked out of the courthouse into the Illinois sunlight. I did not feel victorious. I felt hollow. The legal battle was over, but the moral one had just begun. I met with the district attorney the following week. I gave them the USB drive and the folder Paul had given me. I told them everything. They opened an investigation into my father's business practices. The stores were closed. The assets were frozen. The name Caldwell Home Goods, which had stood for 35 years, was gone within 2 months. My mother transferred to a different facility, closer to Denver, where I could visit her regularly. She was deteriorating slowly, but she was lucid enough to tell me she was proud of me. She said I had done the hard thing, the right thing. I was not sure she was right, but I appreciated her saying it. Paul was indicted on 7 counts of forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. He pleaded not guilty. The trial was set for the following year. I was not asked to testify. My evidence was enough. 1 month after the hearing, I received a letter from Paul, smuggled out of the county jail through a mutual acquaintance. It was short. It said, "You won, but you lost too. You have no business, no father, no legacy. You are exactly where I wanted you to be, alone with the truth." I folded the letter and put it in the same drawer where I had found my father's records. I did not respond. I sold the house in Willow Creek. I used the proceeds to set up a trust for my mother's care. I kept only one thing from my father's belongings, a framed photograph of him and me at a company picnic when I was 8 years old. We were both laughing. I did not know what the joke was, but I remembered that he had held my hand the entire walk back to the car. The business was gone. The money was gone, but something else had taken root. I had stopped believing that truth was something you could inherit. It was something you built, piece by piece, even when the pieces did not fit the story you wanted to tell. And then, a year later, I received a package from the district attorney's office. Inside were my father's personal effects, returned after the investigation was closed. Among them was an envelope I had never seen before, addressed to me in my father's handwriting, dated the day he died. The envelope was plain, my father's handwriting shaky but legible. I opened it sitting at my kitchen counter in Denver, the same counter where I had once stared at 29 missed calls from Illinois. Inside was a single page, folded twice. He wrote that he knew he had failed me. He knew he had let Paul manipulate him for years. He knew the business was built on compromises that could never be undone. But he wanted me to know that the art he kept in that filing cabinet was not guilt. It was pride. He said that when he looked at my drawings, he saw someone who had the courage to make something true in a family built on lies. He said I was the only good thing he ever made. Then he wrote that he had left the recordings and documents not to destroy Paul, but to give me a choice. He said he trusted me to do what he could not, to face the truth and decide what kind of person I wanted to be. I folded the letter and placed it next to the photograph from the company picnic. I understood, finally, that my father had been both the man who built an empire on corruption and the man who kept every crayon drawing his daughter ever made. Both truths could exist at the same time. The question was not which one to believe. The question was which one to let define the future. I still have the letter. I still have the drawings. I visit my mother twice a month. She does not remember all the details anymore, but she remembers my name, and she remembers that I came back. That is enough. Paul was convicted on 5 of 7 counts. He is serving 8 years. I have not spoken to him since the night I walked out of his house. I do not plan to. The stores are gone. The legacy Richard Caldwell thought he was building is dust. But something else survived. A daughter who learned that inheritance is not property or reputation. It is the hard choice to live honestly, even when honesty costs everything. If you have ever carried a secret that felt too heavy to hold alone, if you have ever wondered whether the truth is worth the wreckage it leaves behind, I hope you find the courage I found. Not to win, to be free. Thanks for watching. If this story resonated, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear that the past does not have to own you. The truth is yours to choose. I will see you in the next one.